My name is Sarah Payne, and I'm going to show you another way to use squares. Personally, I think squares are hugely underrated. I love squares, and actually the first chapter in my book, Sarah Payne's Quilt School, is all about squares. But the block that I'm going to show you how to make is this one. This is a checkerboard, and all of those pieces are 1 inch square. So don't panic. I'm going to show you an easy way to do it so that your sewing table doesn't look like it's covered in confetti. So you've seen that wonderful checkerboard block with all of those teeny tiny squares, and you're probably thinking, how on earth am I going to do that? Well, the answer is it's a lot more simple than you think. So first of all, you are going to need to cut some strips from 2 contrasting fabrics. They can be plain or patterned, but you will need 6 1.5 inch wide strips from each of your 2 fabrics. So that's it's about 3/4 of a fat quarter, and you want to cut from selvage to selvage. So this is the selvage here with the fuzzy bits on the end. So you want to cut that way. That will be your longest direction for your fat quarter. And you want 6 from each fabric. Okay. So then you've got your pile of fabrics. You're thinking, my goodness, now I need to cut these down into 1.5 inch squares, and I'm going to end up with a pile of 1.5 inch squares. Actually, you're not, because what we're going to do is we're going to take these fabrics and we are going to put them right sides together, basically pretty sides together. So the fabric pattern, and we are going to sew with an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance down one side of each pair. Okay, so we're going to do that. We'll do a pair, and then we'll have another pair, and personally I do 3 pairs at a time, because 3 pairs will give you half of your block, and it's quite rewarding when you see it actually working. So, and then we have another pair, put them right sides together, take them to your sewing machine and sew down one side. You do need to be fairly accurate with your fat quarter seam allowance, so do check it as you go along, because the smaller a piece is, the more seam allowance gets used up as you work through the block. Which means if you're slightly generous or slightly too small on your seam allowance at the beginning, by the time you get to the end, you've really compounded that, and your block may not finish at 12.5 inches. So I'm going to take these to the sewing machine now, and then sew them together in pairs. So our next step is to press our pairs. And that's pretty simple to do. We're just going to take our iron and press it flat to set those seams. And then we want to press to the darker fabric. So to do that, you're going to have your dark fabric on the top. You place your iron on the lighter fabric and just use the weight of the iron to push back that fabric. And you'll see that it's actually pressing automatically to the darker side. So just to show you that again, you put your iron on the light fabric and just use the weight of the iron to press that. So you're going to repeat that with your 3 pairs. It's best to iron as you go because it just makes it easier. So we're going to do those 3 pairs, and then we're going to sew those 3 pairs together and then press them again. So we have stitched all our pairs together, and you can see now we've got 6 strips in a row. It's important about the pressing at this point. If I turn it over, you'll see that the pressing, I've pressed all of the seams into the dark. As you've been doing that in pairs, that was fine, but make sure when you sew those pairs together as well that you keep your pressing consistent, because that will really help when we want to lock our seams together. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take that rotary cutter and we're going to take our ruler and we are going to start trimming down our pieces. Now, the first thing we want to do is chop off any sort of raggedy ends, but you want to make sure that your lines of your strips sit straight with the lines on your ruler, and you need to keep this consistent. So the first thing we're going to do is chop off the end. There we go, and that's out the way. Now we're going to rotate our fabric. Lay your ruler back on top and we're going to trim this at 1.5 inches. So you can see here, there's my 1.5 inch line. I want to make sure that my fabric is nice and smooth and that I've not pressed any tucks into it. And then I'm going to line the edge up, but make sure that these lines continue to remain nice and straight. So we're going to cut one. Here's our next one. 2. Now, as you go, because naturally when you stitch, fabric can start to bend, you may find that your pieces do not stay parallel the whole time. If they start to bend, just turn it round, back the other way again, trim it off straight again. So this is actually remaining pretty straight, but trim that off so that we're nice and straight again, and then come back to this point. Now, as I said, you're going to need 12 sets of this from this strip. Okay, and remember this is a repeat, so this is for half the block. So we're going to cut this into 12 strips and then we'll come back again. And there we go, that's 11 and 12. You see, you could probably get another one out of that. So if you're working on a whole quilt, you will get extra bits left over. So then we're going to take our piece. So here's one, and you can see where they went together. But what we're actually going to do now is rotate that second piece and sew those together, so that will go right sides together. This is where the pressing is important, because you should find that with pressing in opposite directions that these will actually lock in. So just here, those lock in nicely and they'll keep nice and flat, and as we go, and you will sew row to row to row, but each time rotating so you get that checkerboard effect. And we'll keep continuing as you sew them together. We'll see how it comes out. So here's just 4 rows so far. So obviously I will keep continuing adding to this and rotating until we've got a set of 12. So this is 1/2 of the block. As I go along, this will be 12 here, and that's from our original 3 sets, 3 pairs. So you'll do this, and then you'll repeat it again for the other half of the block. So now, after much sewing and pressing, we have 2 lots, 6 by 12 strips, 6 that way, 12 that way, of 1 inch pieces. You can see here they are. So what I've done as well is make sure you press the seams in opposite directions. So in this case, my seams are going that way, and in this case, my seams are going that way. Also make sure when you are sewing them together that these top 2 here are opposite. For example, if you stopped there, you would actually see you've got 2 together. So make sure when you're sewing your strips together that when you get to this point, you have got opposing at the ends. Then we're going to take them right sides together, fabric sides together, And you might benefit at this point from actually pinning, because that could be quite useful, because there's a lot to get lined up here, and they should line up because, as I said, you've pressed your seams in opposite directions, so that allows you to butt them up together with your fingers like that and pin them. And you can make any adjustments at this point, because you know it's just natural that as you're sewing long strips that you may drift off one side to the other. But if you're pinning and going through carefully at this point, you can actually make a little adjustment if your seam allowance has drifted on one block rather than the other. So then you'll take this to the sewing machine and stitch along that edge, press it, and your block will be finished. And with a good press, our block is finished. And we didn't have to cut out all of those teeny tiny little squares.